So there's a classic discussion to be had when deciding where to begin a story like this. We can all fairly confidently say the story of Dungeons & Dragons does not begin with Gygax. But then, where do you start? The guy who adapted Chainmail to single player? Do we go back to the guy who inspired both of them? Do we go all the way back to Freda Sieve? Freda Sieve was a pianist. She wasn't always a pianist, but her husband died and she was bored, so she learned piano with a friend and started hosting charity concerts to provide scholarships. On the side, she ran a novelties business. Drug companies give away a bunch of novelty junk to doctors to keep them loyal, and Freda Sieve made a business of coming up with the fun novelty junk. One item she came up with was a 12-sided die with a month of the calendar on each face.
I'm not gonna lie. That's a die that I don't have, but I want now.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. But her next creation would be a bit more recognizable. A set of 5 dice for a game of her own devising called Zaz. Zaz was a simple number counting game. There's no evidence her dice were any sort of inspiration for what came later, but it's clear that the idea was in the air, and she got there first. We could start with Charles S. Roberts, a Maryland native who invented the war game tactics, which is largely credited with starting the boom of big popular commercial war games. But it was his next game, Gettysburg, a board game / war game that took the world by storm. Both Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson would credit this game with getting them started as wargaming enthusiasts and designers. Unfortunately, that storm came about 10 years late for him, after a recession had forced him to hand his company, Avalon Hill, over to creditors. This guy fascinates me. He is almost certainly the single most important inspiration for all the guys who will come later in this story, but he doesn't spend his time at Gen Con. No, he moves on to trains. And as the wargaming hobby he helped start turns into a multi-million-dollar industry, he writes a series of books about train history at the B&O. He could have surely leveraged his name and design experience to get a lasting career in game design, but he didn't. He was busy with his trains. He didn't even seem to notice the commotion he'd started. And with a polite and quiet congeniality, he steps gracefully into the history books to write a 9-part series about a history of the B&O that ends in the final volume where he, and I'm quoting Wikipedia here, movingly pays tribute to his late first wife, Patricia. Good for you, man. Sure, you might miss out on the cocaine and the Hollywood stuff, but you also avoided the satanic panic and the myriad crashes. You didn't have to put up with any of that shit. You just got to enjoy trains. What a life.
Just imagining one of those little wooden train track sets.
Exactly. Yeah, that's this man.
Everything on fire in the background.
Absolutely. Many have chosen to start with David Wesley. David had rediscovered a formerly popular game called Strategos in the University of Minnesota library. Strategos used a discipline called Kriegspiel, a way of handling the rules where the referee would decide the outcome in any situation the rules didn't specifically cover. David Wesley modified Strategos into a special gaming event he called a Bronstein, half party game, half massive war game. He had each participant take on a role and play it out for the duration of the game. At the end, everyone would turn in their orders and the referee would adjudicate the results in the Kriegspiel style. He later says, "I thought of the wacky rolls as a joke on my players, and did not expect we would be repeating my multi-objective game anytime soon. However, the players were of a different mind, and after 2 flops when I realized that the key was letting the players try to do whatever they wanted and not worrying about how to score the game, we started playing a lot of Bronsteins."
So the style itself is called Kriegspiel, like the style.
That's the original. Correct. So in these sort of military games where they had a referee who would adjudicate, that in the Prussian style was called Kriegspiel.
That's interesting to me because as someone who knows a bit of German, Krieg is the German word for war, right? And Spiel is the word for play. So it's literally war play. And sometimes things don't fit cleanly into the rules, but it's just barely cool enough where it's like, let's do it anyway.
Absolutely. Sounds a lot like D&D to me. In 1972, the world was big. The internet was still a twinkle in Al Gore's eye, and so communication happened at the speed of monthly magazines and mail-in letters. If you were a hobbyist, often your only communication with other hobbyists was in the letters to the editor section of your favorite hobby magazine, a convention, or your gaming association. Back in these days, it was common for gamers to form associations. These were basically just clubs for adults. In fact, David Wesley was a member of the Midwest Military Simulation Association. Another such association was the International Federation of Wargaming, or the IFW. They tried to hold a convention that ended in the main organizer being stuck with a $200 catering bill and Avalon Hill roasting the event as pretty much a flop in their magazine. In today's money, that $200 is $1,800. This dude, on his first go ever, spent the equivalent of $2,000 on catering, got barely anyone to show up, and quit the IFW. Gary Gygax was appointed the next organizer, and he moved the event to his hometown of Lake Geneva. He paid $15 to rent a large room. His event had around 90 people show up, which merited a success, and thus Gen Con was born. Out of his rising star in the community and the many connections he'd made running Gen Con, Gary formed the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association. Gary Gygax was a shoe repairman by day, but only ever as much as was necessary to pay his bills. His true passion was making games. Meanwhile, another member of the IFW named Don Lowry had just come across a novel idea. Taking the miniatures he saw used in other games, he wanted to create wargaming rules which used miniatures. He formed Guidon Games and hired Jeff Perrin and Gary Gygax to help him create a series of rule sets for different periods using miniatures. Jeff Perrin devised a set of rules which Gary Gygax expanded and edited into Chainmail, which quickly became Guidon Games' bestseller. But Gygax was a nerd, and he loved fantasy. As much as he enjoyed a wargame, he also wanted to create a game which could support play in a fantasy world like the ones he'd spent so much time reading. And so, he appended, almost like a shameful secret at the end of the book, 14 pages of additional rules for using the wargame in a fantasy setting, with spells like lightning and fireball. Not too far away, Dave Arneson was growing as another central figure in the world of wargaming. Dave had his own setting named Blackmore that he'd been devising for some time. He'd seen the growth of Strategos, the revival of Kriegspiel philosophy, and he'd played Chainmail with its fantasy rules. With some adaptation, he changed Chainmail from being a war game to being a game where you could control one character, like a Bronstein. He used the fantasy supplement of Chainmail to fit the game into his fantasy setting of Blackmore, and he himself took the role of referee to create scenarios for the players and settle rules disputes. Gygax heard about this version of Chainmail and played it himself. After playing, he knew they had something special. He had Dave Arneson send him his rough notes, and just as Gygax had done for the work of Jeff Perrin previously, he revised and edited and formalized those rules into a complete game. Original Dungeons & Dragons. Of course, at the time, it was just called Dungeons & Dragons. He tried to sell the game to Guidon, but Don Lowry wasn't really interested. He was already moving on from gaming. This left Gygax in a tricky situation. His friend Donald Kay had around $1,000 to invest, but Gygax had virtually nothing. They needed another partner. They turned to Brian Bloom, another member of the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association, who invested another $2,000.
What is that equivalent to today?
$2,000?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, you're putting me on the fucking spot here. $2,000, 1974 inflation. That would be about $12,000 in today's money. Oh. Yeah, quite an investment in another friend. And so, Tactical Studies Rules was formed in 1972. Personally, I feel like Brian Bloom gets a bad shake in the stories which come after. He's often treated as an opportunistic, greedy money man. However, Brian and Gary are about to ride a 10-year roller coaster, and none of those years will look particularly glamorous for quite some time. They're about to enter trenches they could not have fathomed when they started out stapling books together in a garage in 1973. The game they're hand-making will go on to shape an entire decade of early computer games. It'll become a cartoon, it'll become a movie, it'll become a fad and a crusade, it'll get its own hate group, it'll become the hero and the villain of the entire tabletop space. It will start controversies, and it will be blamed for deaths. And for all of that, Brian Bloom never simply sold his shares and walked away, so it's hard for me to imagine he didn't truly care about this. And let's be honest, not many people are going to exit this story in sterling condition. Sadly, shortly after founding the company, Donald Kay died, leaving Gary and Brian as the primary owners. However, the game was doing well in spite of it all. As fast as they could staple books together, The books would be shipped out and sold. By 1975, they needed to formalize their structure. Tactical Studies Rules became TSR Hobbies Inc. Gygax didn't have the money to buy out Kay's widow, so shortly after dividing the company in two, Brian and his father poured in a commanding $34,000 of investment. The Bloom family was now in control of TSR. They maintained that control until 1985. However, they would continue to place Gygax as the president. On paper, Gygax was in control, but according to everything that mattered legally, the Blooms had just been given control. In 1975, Tim Kask was brought in. He was the first full-time employee of the company. A lot of people we've talked about have been given enormous credit for the creation of D&D, but if you want my opinion, this guy should be listed beside Gygax and Arneson. Sure, he didn't create the foundational rules, but he did something that I think is almost more important. He curated the Dragon magazine. The Strategic Review was the house organ for TSR. A house organ was basically a magazine which existed to advertise the products of the company it was made by. When Tim Kask came in, the Strategic Review was being rebranded to Dragon Magazine. The focus was less on TSR and its products and more about becoming the central magazine for wargamers and tabletop enthusiasts, and the beating heart of it was Tim Kask. And Kask made it funny. Tim Kask is, by all accounts, a character. Interviews with him show his boisterous personality. The day before his retirement, Kim Mohan recalls his job interview with Kask. He says, "The first thing I saw of what was to be my future boss was the bottom of his feet. He had his shoes off and his feet on the desk like he didn't have a care in the world, which I was soon to learn he didn't." Kask would only be part of TSR for the next 5 years, but so much of the tone of the company and how it interacted with fans was established by Kask's boisterous personality. He wrote funny articles at the top of each magazine, drawing in the readers and making them feel like they were just hanging out with their friends at the gaming shop. Kask managed to cut through the chaos of a young company that barely knew what it was doing, to grapple a dozen articles, pieces of art, and ads together each month into a magazine, and send it out to a truly ravenous crowd of enthusiasts. Dragon Magazine was, for many, the first glimpse into what was going on in gaming outside of your tiny gaming association. Gamers could share tips and stories and tricks with each other from across the entirety of the country, and TSR was savvy enough to see that this was an excellent recruitment tool. For the next 2 decades, many of the greatest, most prolific talents in Dungeons & Dragons writing would come from contributors to Dragon Magazine and its eventual co-magazine, Dungeon. I continuously saw in my research for this series that so many of the prolific talents of the tabletop industry started out by seeing an ad in Dragon Magazine. In a moment, the world contracted. It had just permanently gotten a little smaller for gamers everywhere. That's just going to keep happening.
I'm very interested in the art of Dragon Magazine over there.
Oh my goodness, Dragon Magazine. This is the first volume of Dragon Magazine.
Those are green words on there?
Well, now, okay, so let's be fair a little bit here. These are highly compressed images from my timeline here. So if I just, I'll do an image search for Dragon Magazine here, and I'll put that on my screen, and we can take a look at some of these amazing covers. The Dragon is a collection of some of the most incredible painters and illustrators that have ever been in the hobby. This is that cover that we were just looking at. It still looks bad, even at a bigger resolution, but so much of my research was spent reading Dragon Magazine, and it's just such a delight. And I really don't think people acknowledge enough how much of an impact Dragon Magazine really makes in forming D&D.
I hadn't heard of it before your book report here.
Well, there you go. See, we're off to the races. Well, you're going to hear about it a lot more in the next couple of episodes, because basically everyone who joins the story for a little while is going to be like, yeah, I saw an ad in Dragon Magazine and decided to drive down to Lake Geneva and see if I could get a job. But we'll get more into that later. For now, let's move on to your contribution to this episode.
Oh boy.
Which is your character. We decided that the only way to properly celebrate the original version of Dungeons, or each edition of Dungeons and Dragons, is to make a character in each edition of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes.
And so, as the rules dictate, I rolled your stats, and I rolled pretty bad.
Except for gold. I got gold.
I rolled a 14 for gold, and that was the highest number I rolled on the entire sheet. But you've got an 11 strength, an 8 intelligence, 10 wisdom, 12 con, 12 dex, and 7 charisma. And of course, using the rules in the OD&D rules, you have taken a minus to wisdom for a plus to dex, so that you get to 13 dexterity and thus a plus 5% plus 10% bonus to experience points gained.
A little itty bitty bonus.
Yep, a little 10% bonus to experience points gained. Additionally, we have gone with the Greyhawk Supplements Thief class.
Fighting man was a consideration, but that 11 strength did not look too fancy.
Absolutely. And so since we've gone for the thief class, we have leather armor, an armor class of 7. Armor classes go down in this game, not up.
Golf. That's why I wrote golf up there.
It's golf. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Let me zoom in on golf here. Give the people golf. Now your character is. What's his name here?
Filbert Archer.
Filbert Archer.
Phil Archer.
What a name.
Just a lad.
love this little art. Oh my god. What an amazing little drawing you did here. And just like right off the cuff so quickly too.
I just needed a little guy.
It's so cute. Gender gremlin, age 21, race halfling.
So he can
alignment was chaotic, but apparently
in the book it says halflings are lawful but sometimes neutral, and that matters here.
Yeah, so we had to change it to neutral. The rules would not let you be chaotic. But honestly, I feel like the slashed out chaotic is the most chaotic thing that could be here. Your saving throws are a fifth level wizard's saving throws,
because
which is unfortunately the same as a first level wizard saving throw.
Because halflings get a little up power from dwarves for some reason.
Yeah, halflings operate. They have the magic resistance of dwarves.
Yeah.
Move rate 12. Sure. Languages, common, neutral, halfling, of course.
That's right, halfling, yeah, I forgot.
Open locks, you got open locks, remove so this was actually super controversial when it came out, adding these skills to the game, because it kind of begs the question of like, well, couldn't we all do that before? Now that you've introduced that this is specifically a thief thing, does this mean I can't do it anymore? Like,
because
what?
we didn't find any basis for it, I guess, other classes doing that, like, after that
but like,
point.
what
like, is
kind
it
of bizarre world do we live in where a fighter cannot, like a fighting man cannot pickpocket, right? Like if he tries to do it, will his arm fall off? Like, what happens?
I think what happens is he punches you so hard that he loots your dead body, which if you only have 3 health is,
halflings get a +3 to hit, a dexterity bonus of +1 because they have over 12 dexterity. So they have +4 on ranged attacks with a sling. A sling's damage is 1 to 4 points or 1 to 6 points against larger targets, using the optional weapon damage rule from Greyhawk.
I'm wondering, why is it stronger against bigger things?
I think, honestly, if I had to guess, it's because of the Bible story about David and the Goliath.
Really?
If I had to guess, it's literally just
sense.
that. Right? Yeah.
How could Dungeons and Dragons be satanic then?
It's a great question. You got your armor, you got your equipment. So you bought a short bow, sling, 2 daggers, leather armor. And of course, they measure weight in this game in gold coins.
Yeah,
so
I didn't know how much that stuff actually weighed.
Yeah, the weight of leather armor is 300 gold coins.
Because that was a backpack. And I'm like, well, basically, you could probably fit a halfling in a backpack. You just cut little leg holes out at the bottom, little holes for the arms. That's
leg holes?
Yeah, at the bottom. You heard what I said.
I heard what you said.
But yeah, like, I'm probably just, just wearing a backpack. Listen, I put gremlin as my character's gender, so that would make sense.
And then I feel like, because you poured so much effort into it, I do feel like we need to come down to these 2-hit armor class modifiers here. Boy, did we wrestle with these. We fought these for at least a half hour earlier today.
Because the sling's not actually on there.
Yeah, going across 3 different books, and it's just, whoo, boy, it was rough. It was extremely rough. And the sling, so like, in this edition, they added the sling in the Greyhawk supplement, but they didn't actually give it a set of statistics or rolls to hit.
Yeah.
Like, they just gave it a damage dice, and that was, like, they forgot how their own system works.
I found one thing online where it was like, yeah, just, you kind of do the halfway point between a short bow and a long bow. And I was like, oh no.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was an absolute delight making this character with you, going through the process of going back. I mean, it wasn't a delight playing original Dungeons & Dragons, but it was a play hanging out with you. It was a delight hanging out with you. And I you know, if you had any sort of large takeaways from OD&D, if you had any sort of, like, single thing after reading the books and grappling with them, what is the one thing that really stuck out to you?
So, funnily enough, the one thing that stuck out is actually about, so originally when you showed me the character sheet, you had mentioned it's like, oh, it's, small, you could have it on like a little note card. No, you can't! You need 3 other books or like a bunch of little cutouts of all the, there's so many tables, just keeping track.
Well, the idea is that the GM is handling all the tables in the background, that you as the player are just rolling a dice and then telling the GM what you rolled, and he tells you what happens afterwards. Because, yeah,
but you as the player also probably should be aware, if you're trying to hit someone with plate armor, that actually you will never hit them because you have like a -5 or 7.
I feel like I've heard that almost no one used those specific weapon versus specific armor ACs, and there's a reason. It's a nightmare. It's truly horrifying.
The one thing, like, I can appreciate that like the whole table there, mainly after I figured out, like, oh, the reason why this is alternating between, a +1 and a +2 is because this is specifically better when there is no shield involved, and shields is even armor classes only. If you have a shield, you have an even armor class. I felt so big-brained when I made that connection.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly something to, like, really reading and rereading. I promise you, I've done this a couple of times now where I've gone back to OD&D and made a character. Every couple of years I do it just for the experience of doing it. And every single time I find a rule that I never knew existed. Because this book is wild. The layout here is labyrinthine, I would say. Anyway,
you're hunting between the different books, constantly going back and forth, trying to decipher, like, what numbers go on here and what do they mean.
Ailoth, my friend, I thank you so much for helping me out with this first episode. I really appreciate it. I don't think I would have done it if it were just me, so I'm really glad that you gave me the extra motivation to get to the finish line here.
It was fun.
Yeah, and hopefully I'll be doing this again. Next up, I think we're looking at Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, that's already on the sheet a little bit. I a little bit.
Yeah. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then Basic, and then Beck me, and off we go to the races. Yeah, thank you. Thanks again. And now I'm going to transition to the end screen. Goodbye.
Bye.